When your life's work is caring for animals, watching them suffer breaks something inside you that never quite heals. Dr. Mabel Kemp thought she'd seen every heartbreak the farming life could offer until the day perfect circular holes began, appearing in cowhides across Millbrook County, Wisconsin. Each lesion was identical, 2 inches in diameter, clean-edged, as if punched by some precise instrument. The animals showed no signs of pain or infection, yet the phenomenon was spreading. At 68, Mabel had been enjoying a quiet retirement, tending her late husband's garden and avoiding the complexities of modern farming. But when desperate farmers called her back into service, she couldn't refuse. These weren't just her and neighbors. They were the last guardians of a way of life that corporate agriculture was slowly strangling. What Mabel would discover would shake the foundation of everything these farming families believed about progress and tradition. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Mabel's kitchen table as she turned Harold's wedding ring between her fingers, a habit she'd developed in the 2 years since his passing. The simple gold band caught the light, and for a moment she could almost hear his voice, warning her about getting pulled back into other people's problems. "You can't save everyone, Mabel," he used to say, but his eyes always held that gentle understanding that she'd try anyway. The phone had been ringing since dawn. Tom Brennan's voice still echoed in her mind from the night before, strained, desperate in a way that made her chest tighten. 43 years of veterinary practice had taught her to read the fear in a farmer's voice, and Tom's carried the weight of a man watching his life's work slip away. She slipped Harold's ring onto her thumb and reached for her father's old veterinary journal. The leather cover was worn smooth from decades of handling, its pages filled with careful observations about cattle diseases, breeding notes, and the kind of practical wisdom that came from understanding animals as individuals rather than production units. Her father had been old school, believing that good veterinary medicine started with patient observation and ended with common-sense solutions. The journal fell open to a familiar page. "Remember, Mabel, when something doesn't make sense, look at what changed recently. Animals don't lie." 3 farms, 3 separate operations run by families she'd known for decades. Tom Brennan's dairy had been in his family for 4 generations. The Hoffmans had been raising cattle since before Wisconsin became a state. The Clearwater operation was newer, started by Bill Clearwater after he returned from Vietnam, but no less committed to quality farming. What connected them? Mabel rose and walked to her kitchen window, gazing across the familiar landscape of rolling hills dotted with red barns and Holstein cattle. This was home in the deepest sense. Not just the house she'd shared with Harold, but the community. They'd served together. He'd handled the large animals while she focused on small pets and emergency calls, but they'd both understood that veterinary medicine in a rural community meant being part of something larger than themselves. The Millbrook County farming community had weathered plenty of storms over the years. Market crashes, droughts, disease outbreaks, and the steady pressure of corporate agriculture buying up family operations. But they'd survived by sticking together, sharing knowledge, and maintaining the values that had sustained rural life for generations. Those values were under assault now. Young farmers were leaving for cities, unable to compete with industrial operations. Those who stayed often found themselves forced to adopt new methods, new feeds, new hormones, new technologies, just to keep their margins thin enough to survive another year. Sarah Mitchell represented that new world. Mabel had encountered the corporate agriculture representative several times at community meetings, always impeccably dressed, armed with statistics and promises of increased productivity. Sarah spoke fluently about profit margins and efficiency gains, but Mabel had noticed she never talked about the animals themselves. The corporate approach reduced cattle to production units, measuring success solely in milk yield and cost per gallon. It was efficient, profitable, and completely removed from the intimate knowledge of individual animals that had always been the foundation of good farming. But it worked. That was the frustrating truth that kept farmers like Tom Brennan awake. At night, the corporate methods delivered results, at least in the short term. Dr. James Walsh embodied this new generation of veterinary practice. Fresh from veterinary school, armed with the latest equipment and techniques, he'd taken over much of the large animal practice when Mabel and Harold had begun scaling back. Walsh was competent, thorough, and completely confident in modern veterinary science. He was also impatient with what he called old-fashioned approaches. During their few interactions, Walsh had made it clear that he considered Mabel's methods outdated. He relied heavily on laboratory tests, sophisticated diagnostic equipment, and pharmaceutical solutions. Results came from data, not intuition. The contrast was stark. Where Mabel might spend an hour observing an animal's behavior before making a diagnosis, Walsh would run comprehensive blood work and move on to the next case. Both approaches had merit, but they represented fundamentally different philosophies about the relationship between humans and animals. The phone rang again, jarring Mabel from her thoughts. She recognized Martha Hoffman's voice immediately, gravelly, from decades of cigarettes, but sharp as ever. "Mabel, honey, I know Tom already called you about this business with the cattle." Martha didn't waste time on pleasantries. At 72, she'd earned the right to speak directly. "But I wanted you to hear this from me. We've got 6 cows with these damn holes, and they're getting bigger." Bigger how? Started small, maybe the size of a quarter. Now they're silver dollar-sized, and I swear to God they look like someone took a cookie cutter to my animals. Mabel felt the familiar tightening in her stomach that came with encountering something beyond her experience. Are the animals showing any discomfort? That's the thing that's got me spooked. They're acting normal, eating fine, milk production hasn't dropped. It's like they don't even know these holes are there. What does Dr. Walsh say? Martha's pause spoke volumes. He says it's probably some kind of skin condition, wants to treat them with antibiotics and see what happens. But Mabel, I've been raising cattle since before that boy was born, and I've never seen anything like this. After hanging up, Mabel found herself standing in Harold's study, surrounded by veterinary texts, medical journals, and the accumulated wisdom of 2 lifetimes dedicated to animal care. The room still smelled faintly of his pipe tobacco, a scent that had once annoyed her but now provided comfort. Her phone buzzed with a text from her daughter Elena in California. "Mom, haven't heard from you in weeks. Everything okay?" The message carried the weight of their complicated relationship. Elena had inherited her parents' strong moral compass, but had channeled it into environmental activism rather than veterinary medicine. Their conversations had become increasingly strained, as Elena's criticism of industrial agriculture had grown more pointed. Elena saw her mother's career as complicit in a system that prioritized profit over animal welfare and environmental sustainability. Mabel understood the criticism intellectually, but it stung emotionally. She'd spent her life caring for animals, and Eleanor's accusations felt like a betrayal of everything she'd worked for. The irony wasn't lost on her that Eleanor might actually understand the current situation better than anyone. Environmental activists had been warning for years about the unintended consequences of industrial farming practices. They'd pointed to hormone use, antibiotic resistance, and feed additives as potential sources of problems that wouldn't surface. Until years later, but Elena was in California, pursuing her own version of making the world better through protest and policy advocacy. She'd chosen a path that kept her as far from the family business as possible, both geographically and philosophically. The distance between them had grown after Harold's death. Eleanor had flown home for the funeral, stayed a week, and then returned to her life in San Francisco. Their phone calls had become dutiful rather than warm, filled with careful questions about each other's health and weather, rather than the deep conversations they'd once shared. Mabel missed her daughter fiercely. But she also resented the implicit judgment in Elena's choices. It felt like a rejection not just of rural life, but of the values and commitment that had shaped their family for generations. The afternoon brought another call from Tom Brennan. His voice carried a desperation that made Mabel's heart ache. "Dr. Kemp, I've got 12 cows affected now. Whatever this is, it's spreading. My grandfather would roll over in his grave if he saw what's happening to this place." Tom's family history embodied everything that was both admirable and heartbreaking about rural American farming. 4 generations of Brennans had worked the same land, survived the Great Depression, sent sons to multiple wars, and maintained their independence through decades of economic pressure. Tom himself had returned home after college, choosing farming over more lucrative opportunities in the city. He'd modernized carefully, adopting new techniques gradually while maintaining the core values his family had always emphasized: respect for the land, care for the animals, and commitment to producing high-quality food. The current crisis threatened everything he'd worked to preserve. If the conditions spread to his entire herd, the economic consequences could force him to sell, ending 4 generations of family farming. "I'll be there tomorrow morning," Mabel told him, surprised by her own words. That evening, she sat in Harold's chair, reading veterinary journals and medical texts, searching for any reference to similar conditions. The more she read, the more convinced she became that whatever was affecting these cattle was something new, or at least something that hadn't been widely documented. The holes were too uniform, too precise to be caused by typical skin conditions. They showed no signs of infection, inflammation, or healing response. It was as if something was dissolving the tissue from within, creating perfectly circular openings that the animals' bodies couldn't recognize as injuries. As darkness fell across Millbrook County, Mabel made a decision that would change everything. She would come out of retirement, not because she missed veterinary practice, but because 3 farming families needed someone who understood that their animals were more than production units. She twisted Harold's ring on her thumb and wondered what he would have advised. Probably the same thing he'd always told her: trust your instincts, ask the right questions, and remember that good medicine starts with caring about the patient. Tomorrow, she would begin asking questions that would uncover truths no one wanted to face. The first light of dawn was breaking across the Brennan farm when Mabel pulled her old Ford into the gravel driveway. Tom met her at the gate, his face drawn with exhaustion and worry. Dark circles under his eyes suggested he hadn't been sleeping. "Well, thank you for coming, Dr. Kemp. I know you're retired, but show me the animals, Tom." The barn was immaculate, a testament to 4 generations of proper animal husbandry. The Holstein cows were healthy-looking specimens, well-fed and calmly chewing cud in clean stalls. But even from a distance, Mabel could see what had driven Tom to desperation. The holes were unlike anything she'd encountered in 4 decades of practice. Perfectly circular, approximately 2 inches in diameter, they appeared on the animal's flanks and shoulders. The edges were clean, almost surgical, with no signs of inflammation or infection. Most disturbing was the animal's complete lack of reaction to what should have been painful wounds. Mabel approached the first affected cow slowly, speaking in the gentle tones that had calmed nervous animals throughout her career. The Holstein barely acknowledged her presence, continuing to chew contentedly while Mabel examined the lesion. "How long since you first noticed these?" "About 3 weeks. Started with just 1 cow, Bessie there in the corner, then 2 more. Now it's spreading to the whole herd." Mabel ran her fingers along the edge of the hole, feeling for heat, swelling, or sensitivity. The cow showed no reaction. The tissue around the lesion felt normal. No fever, no tenderness, no sign that the animal's body recognized this as an injury. "Tom, walk me through everything that's changed recently. New feed, new supplements, changes in routine. Anything different in the past 2 months?" Tom's face brightened slightly. Well, we did start using that new feed supplement Sarah Mitchell recommended. Nutramax, I think it's called. She said it would boost milk production by 15%. When did you start using it? About a month ago. Sarah brought samples to all the farms, said we were part of a pilot program to test it locally before they rolled it out statewide. Mabel's instincts sharpened. In her experience, when multiple farms developed identical problems simultaneously, there was usually a common factor. Who else is using this supplement? The Hoffmans, the Clearwaters, and I think maybe the Johnson place up north. Sarah was real excited about getting local farmers to try it first. After spending 2 hours examining the affected animals and reviewing Tom's records, Mabel drove to Martha Hoffman's ranch. The Hoffman operation was larger and more traditional, with cattle grazing in expansive pastures rather than confined to barns. Martha met her at the fence line, cigarette dangling from her lips. "Figured you'd want to see for yourself," Martha said without preamble. "They're out in the south pasture." The sight that greeted them was more disturbing than Tom's barn. 23. Cattle showed various stages of the condition, from small quarter-sized holes to larger lesions that exposed underlying tissue. Yet the animals grazed peacefully, showing no distress. "Martha, tell me about this Nutramax supplement." Martha's expression darkened. "That Mitchell woman came around about 6 weeks ago, all smiles and fancy charts. Said this new supplement would revolutionize dairy farming, increase production, reduce feed costs. Sounded too good to be true. But you tried it anyway. Hell, at my age I've got nothing to lose. If it worked, great. If it didn't, I'd go back to the old ways. But Mabel, I've never seen anything like what's happening to these animals." From Martha's ranch, Mabel drove to Clearwater Farm, the newest of the 3 operations. Bill Clearwater had returned from Vietnam in 1972 and used his GI benefits to start a small dairy operation that had grown into a respectable mid-sized farm. He was waiting for her in the farmyard, his weathered hands clasped behind his back in a military stance that decades of civilian life hadn't erased. "Dr. Kemp, appreciate you taking time to look at this. Got to admit, it's got me stumped." Bill's cattle showed the same pattern, perfect circular holes, with no apparent discomfort to the animals. But what caught Mabel's attention was the organization of his operation. Bill maintained detailed records of everything: feed consumption, milk production, animal health, breeding schedules. His military precision had served him well in farming. "Bill, I need to see your records on this Nutramax supplement. When you started using it, how much, any changes you've noticed." Bill led her to a small office in the barn, where filing cabinets lined the walls. He pulled out a thick folder labeled Feed Supplements 2024 inches and spread the contents on a desk. Started the Nutramax on March 15th. Sarah Mitchell brought it personally, said we were getting it at a discount because we were pilot farms. "Look, here." He pointed to a chart tracking milk production. Production did increase, just like she promised, up about 12% over the first 3 weeks. "And when did you first notice the holes?" "April 2nd. Marked it right here in my daily log. 1 cow, small hole on her left flank. Thought maybe she'd scraped herself on something." Mabel studied Bill's meticulous records, cross-referencing the supplement introduction with the first appearance of symptoms. The timeline was consistent across all 3 farms. Nutramax introduction, followed by a 2 to 3 week incubation period. Then the appearance of the mysterious lesions. The afternoon brought an unexpected encounter. As Mabel was leaving the Clearwater farm, a white SUV pulled into the driveway. Sarah Mitchell stepped out, her professional smile faltering slightly when she recognized Mabel. "Dr. Kemp, what a pleasant surprise. I didn't realize you were still practicing." "I'm not. I'm consulting on some unusual cases." Sarah's smile returned, but her eyes remained cautious. "Oh, you mean this minor skin condition. Dr. Walsh is handling it. Nothing to worry about, just a temporary reaction to the changing weather." Temporary reaction. These things happen sometimes. Animals adjust to new conditions. Dr. Walsh assures me it's completely normal and will resolve on its own. Mabel felt a familiar surge of professional skepticism. In her experience, people who dismissed unusual symptoms as normal were usually trying to avoid uncomfortable questions. "Have you seen anything like this before, Miss Mitchell?" "Oh, here and there. You know how it is with livestock. They're always developing minor issues. The important thing is that milk production is up significantly. That's what really matters to these farmers." The conversation left Mabel deeply unsettled. Sarah's casual dismissal of what were clearly serious symptoms suggested either profound ignorance or deliberate deception. Either possibility was troubling. That evening, Mabel spread her findings across Harold's desk, creating a timeline that connected all three farms. The pattern was clear: Nutramax introduction, followed by identical symptoms in multiple animals. The supplement was the only common factor among the affected farms. But what was in Nutramax that could cause such unusual tissue damage? And why weren't the animals showing any signs of pain or distress? Her phone rang at nearly midnight, Elena's voice calling from California. "Mom, I know it's late there, but I couldn't sleep. Something's bothering me about our last conversation. You sounded different, worried about something." For a moment, Mabel considered sharing her concerns about the cattle situation. Elena's environmental science background might provide insights that traditional veterinary medicine couldn't offer, but the wounds from their previous arguments about industrial agriculture were still fresh. "Just some unusual cases I'm consulting on. Nothing you'd be interested in. Mom, you know I care about what you do. Just because we disagree about some things doesn't mean I don't want to help." After hanging up, Mabel sat in Harold's chair, staring at the timeline she'd created. 3 farms, 1 supplement, identical symptoms. The connection was obvious, but proving causation would require more than circumstantial evidence. She reached for Harold's old microscope, stored in the closet since his death. Tomorrow, she would begin collecting tissue samples and conducting the kind of careful investigation that had made her reputation 4 decades earlier. What she discovered would force her to choose between comfortable silence and uncomfortable truth. Harold's microscope sat on the kitchen table like a piece of forgotten history, its brass fittings tarnished, but its optics still sharp. Mabel had retrieved it from the closet that morning, along with the collection of slides and stains they'd used for decades of field diagnoses. The familiar weight of the instrument in her hands brought back memories of countless evenings spent examining samples together, Harold peering over her shoulder as they puzzled through difficult cases. "Trust what you see, not what you're told to see," he used to say. It was advice that had served them well in an era before sophisticated laboratory equipment made detailed tissue analysis routine. The tissue samples she'd collected the previous day told a disturbing story. Under magnification, the edges of the whole showed cellular destruction unlike anything in her experience. The tissue didn't appear cut or torn. It looked dissolved, as if something had systematically broken down the cellular structure from within. More troubling was the complete absence of inflammatory response. Normally, tissue damage triggered immediate immune system activity, white blood cells rushing to the site, blood vessels dilating, the entire cascade of healing responses that produced swelling, heat, and pain. But these samples showed none of that. The surrounding tissue appeared completely normal, as if the animals' bodies couldn't recognize that damage had occurred. Her phone buzzed with a text from Tom Brennan. 3 more cows affected this morning. Whatever this is, it's accelerating. Mabel set down the microscope and reached for her father's veterinary journal. She'd been reading it more frequently since Harold's death, finding comfort in his practical wisdom and methodical approach to difficult problems. The journal fell open to a page she'd marked the night before. When faced with an unknown condition, eliminate what you know it's not. What remains, however unlikely, must be considered. She started a list. Not bacterial. No response to tissue. Damage. No inflammatory markers. not viral, wrong pattern of tissue destruction, not parasitic, no evidence of organisms, not mechanical injury, too uniform, too precise. That left toxic exposure or autoimmune response. Something was either poisoning the animals from within or triggering their immune systems to attack their own tissue. The Nutramax connection seemed obvious, but she needed more than circumstantial evidence. Corporate agriculture companies had legal teams specifically trained to challenge allegations about their products. She would need documented proof that could withstand professional scrutiny. Her investigation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Dr. James Walsh stood on her porch, his expression carefully neutral, but his body language tense. "Dr. Kemp, I understand you've been consulting on some cases in the area. Word travels fast. Small community. I wanted to discuss your findings, compare notes, professional courtesy." Mabel invited him in, noting how his eyes immediately went to the microscope and tissue samples arranged on her kitchen table. Walsh was younger than her by at least 15 years, confident in the way that came from recent training and modern equipment. "I've examined the affected animals extensively," Walsh said, settling into Harold's chair without being invited. "Classic presentation of seasonal dermatitis, possibly complicated by stress factors. Nothing that won't resolve with proper treatment. Seasonal dermatitis doesn't create perfect circles. Skin conditions can present in unusual ways. The important thing is not to alarm the farmers unnecessarily. These are good people working hard to make a living. The last thing they need is panic over what amounts to a minor cosmetic issue." Mabel felt a familiar irritation with his dismissive tone. "Cosmetic issue? James, these holes go completely through the hide. I can see underlying muscle tissue. Temporary condition. The animals aren't in distress. Milk production remains strong. By every meaningful measure, they're healthy. Have you considered the possibility that something in their environment is causing this?" Walsh's expression hardened slightly. "I've run comprehensive tests, blood work, urinalysis, tissue cultures, everything. Comes back normal. Sometimes, Dr. Kemp, experience teaches us not to see problems where none exist." The comment stung because it carried an implicit criticism of her age and retirement status. Walsh was suggesting that her concerns stemmed from outdated thinking, rather than legitimate medical observations. After he left, Mabel called Martha Hoffman. The older woman's voice carried frustration and worry. "That Walsh boy was here this morning, took more blood samples, told me not to worry." Easy for him to say, they're not his cattle. "Martha, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before answering. Have you noticed any other changes since you started using the Nutramax supplement? Behavior, appetite, anything at all?" Martha was quiet for a long moment. "You know, now that you mention it, the milk has been different. Richer somehow, higher fat content. I thought it was good news, better quality product. Anything else?" "The cows seem calmer, less reactive to sudden noises, changes in routine. Bill Clearwater mentioned the same thing when we talked yesterday." Mabel felt a chill of recognition. Increased milk production, higher fat content, reduced stress responses. These weren't necessarily positive changes if they came at the cost of the animal's natural protective mechanisms. It sounded like the supplement might be suppressing normal, physiological responses, including the ability to recognize and respond to tissue damage. That afternoon, she drove to the county extension office, hoping to find information about Nutramax and its ingredients. The extension agent, an earnest young man named David Park, was helpful but limited in what he could access. "I can tell you it's manufactured by Agritech Solutions, a subsidiary of Meridian Agricultural Systems," David said, scrolling through his computer. "But the actual ingredient list is proprietary, trade secrets, you know. What about safety testing, FDA approval? Feed supplements fall into a gray area. If they're classified as nutritional additives rather than medications, the testing requirements are much less stringent. Companies can bring products to market based on internal testing. Mabel left the extension office with more questions than answers. The regulatory framework for feed supplements appeared designed to protect corporate interests rather than animal welfare. Companies could introduce new products with minimal oversight, leaving farmers and veterinarians to discover problems through trial and error. That evening, she found herself staring at Harold's photograph on the mantel. He'd always been better at the political aspects of veterinary medicine, dealing with corporate representatives, navigating regulatory requirements, maintaining professional relationships while advocating for animal welfare. What would you do? She asked the photograph. The answer came in his voice, as clear as if he were sitting beside her. Document everything. Build a case they can't dismiss. And remember, the animals can't speak for themselves. She spent the night organizing her findings into a comprehensive report, timeline of symptom development, microscopic analysis of tissue samples, correlation with Nutramax introduction, and documentation of the animal's altered behavioral responses. By morning, she had the beginnings of a case that connected the supplement to the mysterious condition. But she also had a growing sense that she was up against forces much larger than a simple product safety issue. Sarah Mitchell's dismissive attitude, Dr. Walsh's resistance to investigation, and the regulatory gaps that allowed untested products to reach the market all suggested a system designed to prioritize corporate profits over animal welfare. As she prepared to drive back to the Brennan farm, Mabel realized she was no longer just investigating a medical mystery. She was challenging a system that had powerful interests in avoiding uncomfortable questions about the safety of its products. Elena's letter had been sitting unopened on Mabel's kitchen counter for 3 months, its corner now curled from exposure to steam from the coffee pot. The return address showed the California Environmental Defense Coalition, and Mabel knew without opening it that the contents would be filled with statistics about industrial agriculture's impact on soil, water, and animal welfare, the kind of information that made her uncomfortable about her own profession's complicity in systems she'd always accepted as necessary. But this morning, with Harold's microscope still set up on her kitchen table and tissue samples revealing disturbing truths about Nutramax, Mabel finally opened the envelope. Eleanor's accompanying note was brief. "Mom, thought you might find this interesting given your background. Would love to discuss sometime." The newsletter contained an article titled "Corporate Feed Additives, the Hidden Cost of Increased Production." As Mabel read, her coffee grew cold. The article described cases from across the Midwest where new feed supplements had produced dramatic increases in milk yield, while simultaneously causing previously unknown health problems in dairy cattle. The pattern was familiar: corporate representatives targeting small family farms with promises of increased profitability, minimal regulatory oversight of new products, and veterinarians either unwilling or unable to connect emerging health problems to recently introduced supplements. Her phone rang, startling her from the article. Elena's voice carried a warmth that had been missing from their recent conversations. "Mom, I had the strangest feeling I should call you this morning. How are you doing? Actually, I could use your help with something." The words surprised them both. Mabel had spent the past 2 years carefully avoiding conversations that might lead to Eleanor's criticism of rural life and traditional farming practices. But the current situation required expertise that her veterinary training hadn't provided. "I'm dealing with some cattle that are developing unusual symptoms. There might be a connection to a new feed supplement, but I'm having trouble getting information about its ingredients and safety testing." Elena's voice sharpened with interest. "What kind of symptoms?" Mabel described the circular holes, the lack of inflammatory response, and the correlation with Nutramax introduction. As she spoke, she could hear Elena taking notes. "Mom, this sounds Exactly like the cases we've been tracking through the Environmental Defense Coalition. Companies are using small farming communities as testing grounds for experimental additives. The regulatory framework is so weak that they can introduce products with minimal safety data. Can you help me research the company behind this supplement? Send me everything you have. Product names, manufacturer information, anything you can find. We've got resources for investigating corporate agriculture that might be useful. After hanging up, Mabel felt a complicated mix of relief and apprehension. Elena's expertise could be crucial in uncovering the truth about Nutrimax, but involving her daughter also meant acknowledging that Elena's criticisms of industrial agriculture might be more accurate than Mabel had wanted to admit. The afternoon brought disturbing news from all 3 farms. Tom Brennan reported that 18 cows now showed symptoms, and the holes in the earliest cases were growing larger. Martha Hoffman had found 2 cows with multiple lesions, and Bill Clearwater documented that milk production was continuing to increase even as the physical symptoms worsened. More troubling was the growing pressure from Sarah Mitchell. She had visited each farm that morning, accompanied by a man in an expensive suit who introduced himself as a regional manager from Agritech Solutions. According to Tom, they had expressed concern about unqualified individuals making alarming claims about their product. They didn't mention you by name, Tom told Mabel over the phone, but the message was clear. They're not happy about outside interference. That evening, Mabel drove to Martha Hoffman's ranch for what she hoped would be a quiet consultation. Instead, she found Dr. Walsh's truck already in the driveway. Through the kitchen window, she could see him seated at Martha's table, papers spread between them. Martha met her at the door, her expression apologetic but firm. "Mabel, honey, I'm sorry, but Dr. Walsh says I shouldn't allow any more unauthorized examinations of my cattle." "Unauthorized?" Walsh appeared behind Martha, his professional smile not quite masking his irritation. "Dr. Kemp, I've spoken with the State Veterinary Board about your activities. You're practicing without a current license, which puts both you and these farmers at legal risk." The accusation hit like a physical blow. Mabel's license had lapsed when she retired, a routine administrative matter that she'd never considered problematic for informal consultations. But Walsh was correct. She had no legal authority to examine the animals or collect tissue samples. "I'm helping friends with sick animals. You're conducting unauthorized medical examinations and potentially interfering with established treatment protocols. I have a responsibility to protect both animal welfare and my clients' interests." Martha looked uncomfortable but didn't challenge Walsh's position. The threat of legal liability was something rural families couldn't afford to ignore. Driving home in the gathering darkness, Mabel felt the isolation that came with challenging established authority. Walsh had effectively shut down her investigation by invoking regulatory technicalities. The farmers, caught between loyalty to her and fear of legal consequences, had little choice but to defer to the licensed veterinarian. But legal authority didn't change the scientific evidence she'd already gathered. The tissue samples, microscopic analysis, and timeline correlation all pointed to Nutrimax as the cause of the mysterious condition. The question was, how to act on that knowledge when she'd been officially excluded from further investigation. Her phone buzzed with a text from Elena. "Found some disturbing information about Agritech Solutions. Can you talk?" Elena's voice carried excitement mixed with concern. "Mom, I've been researching the company behind Nutrimax. Agritech Solutions has been cited by environmental regulators in 3 states for introducing experimental additives without proper safety testing. They specifically target rural communities where regulatory oversight is minimal." "What kind of experimental additives?" "Synthetic growth hormones, enzyme modifiers, immune system suppressants, compounds designed to increase production by altering normal physiological responses. The problem is that many of these substances have never been tested for long-term effects." Mabel felt pieces of the puzzle falling into place. Immune system suppressants would explain why the animals aren't showing normal inflammatory responses to tissue damage. Exactly. And Mom, there's something else. We've been tracking similar cases through our network. Mysterious health problems in livestock that correlate with introduction of agritech products. The company has a pattern of moving quickly to contain information and discredit anyone who raises questions. They've already started. Dr. Walsh used regulatory technicalities to shut down my investigation. Then we need to work around the system. I'm flying home tomorrow. The call ended with Mabel staring at her reflection in the kitchen window. Elena was coming home, not for a holiday visit or family obligation, but to help fight a battle against the corporate forces that were threatening the farming community Mabel had served for decades. The irony wasn't lost on her that her daughter's environmental activism, which had driven a wedge between them, might now be the key to protecting the animals and farmers she cared about most. The yellowed pages of the community meeting minutes from 1987 crackled as Mabel turned them, the typewritten text a reminder of an era before computers and digital records. She'd found the document in Harold's filing cabinet while searching for precedents. Other times, when the Millbrook County farming community had faced challenges from outside forces, the 1987 controversy had involved a pesticide manufacturer whose product was linked to a die-off of beneficial insects. The parallels were striking. Corporate representatives dismissing farmer concerns, regulatory agencies slow to respond, and a community divided between economic necessity and environmental protection. But what caught Mabel's attention was the resolution. The farmers had eventually banded together, documented their concerns systematically, and forced a public hearing that led to restrictions on the pesticide's use. It had taken months of careful organization and unified action, but they had prevailed. Against a much larger corporate opponent, the key had been community solidarity, farmers setting aside individual concerns to present a united front. That solidarity was exactly what Sarah Mitchell and Agritech Solutions were trying to prevent now. Eleanor arrived that afternoon, her rental car looking out of place among the pickup trucks and farm equipment that typically filled Mabel's driveway. At 34, she carried herself with the confident posture of someone accustomed to challenging authority, but her hug held the warmth of a daughter who'd missed her mother more than either of them had admitted. "Show me what you found," Elena said without preamble, settling at the kitchen table where Harold's microscope still occupied the center position. Mabel walked her through the timeline, the tissue samples, and the correlation with Nutrimax's introduction. Elena asked sharp questions about methodology, sample collection, and documentation, the kind of probing inquiry that would be necessary if their findings were ever challenged in a legal or regulatory setting. "This is solid scientific work, Mom. But we need more than medical evidence. We need to understand the corporate structure behind this product and document any previous problems they've tried to cover up." Elena opened her laptop and began navigating through databases that Mabel had never heard of. Within an hour, she'd assembled a disturbing picture of Agritech Solutions and its parent company, Meridian Agricultural Systems. "They're a subsidiary of a subsidiary," Elena explained, pointing to an organizational chart on her screen. "Classic corporate structure designed to limit liability. If problems arise with their products, the parent companies can claim ignorance and cut ties." The research revealed a pattern of aggressive marketing, followed by quick retreats when safety issues emerged. Agritech had introduced experimental feed additives in rural communities across 7 states over the past 3 years. When problems arose, they typically offered settlement agreements that included non-disclosure clauses, effectively silencing affected farmers. "The strategy is brilliant from a corporate perspective," Elena said grimly. "Target small farming, communities with limited resources and regulatory oversight. If problems develop, offer enough money to solve immediate financial concerns while preventing public discussion of safety issues. Mabel felt a growing sense of urgency. We need to warn the other farmers before they're pressured into silence. Actually, we need to do the opposite. We need to organize a community response that forces a public discussion before agritech can divide and conquer. That evening they drove to the Grange Hall, where the monthly Farmers Association meeting was already in progress. The building had served as the community's gathering place for over a century, its walls lined with photographs of farming families that went back to the county's founding. Martha Hoffman was speaking when they entered, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd survived decades of agricultural challenges. Told me that Dr. Walsh says these holes are just temporary, but I've been raising cattle longer than that boy's been alive, and I've never seen anything like this. Sarah Mitchell sat in the front row, flanked by two men in business suits, who took notes on everything that was said. Her presence at what was typically a farmers-only meeting suggested that Agritech was monitoring community discussions closely. Bill Clearwater stood to address the group. I've got detailed records showing the correlation between starting Nutrimax and the appearance of these symptoms. The timing's too precise to be coincidental. One of the suited men leaned forward. Mr. Clearwater, correlation doesn't imply causation. There could be numerous environmental factors contributing to this minor skin condition. Minor? Martha's voice carried decades of suppressed frustration. Would you call it minor if it was happening to your animals? The meeting quickly devolved into competing narratives. Sarah Mitchell and her corporate representatives emphasized economic benefits, increased milk production, higher profits, improved competitiveness. They dismissed the physical symptoms as temporary and cosmetic, promising that ongoing research would resolve any concerns. Tom Brennan's voice shook as he stood to speak. My family's been farming this land for 4 generations. We've survived droughts, market crashes, and more challenges than I can count. But we've never had to watch our animals develop mysterious holes while being told not to worry about it. Dr. Walsh rose from his seat near the back. As the licensed veterinarian serving this community, I want to assure everyone that these animals are receiving proper medical care. The condition is being monitored closely, and there's no cause for alarm. Mabel felt Elena's hand touch her arm, a silent encouragement to speak. Standing slowly, she addressed the room of neighbors and friends she'd served for decades. I know I'm retired, and I know some of you have been told not to trust my judgment, but I've examined tissue samples from affected animals, and what I see concerns me deeply. These aren't minor skin irritations. They're symptoms of something that's suppressing the animal's normal protective responses. Sarah Mitchell's professional smile faltered. Dr. Kemp, I understand your concerns, but perhaps it would be more appropriate to leave current cases to currently licensed professionals. Licensed professionals who dismiss valid concerns without proper investigation. The room erupted in competing voices. Farmers who trusted Mabel's decades of experience argued with neighbors who feared legal liability. Corporate representatives took notes, while Dr. Walsh attempted to maintain professional authority over an increasingly skeptical audience. Elena stood beside her mother. I'm Elena Kemp, Dr. Kemp's daughter. I work with the California Environmental Defense Coalition, and we've been tracking Agritech Solutions activities in rural communities across multiple states. What's happening here follows a pattern we've seen elsewhere. And what pattern is that? Sarah Mitchell's voice carried a warning edge. Experimental products introduced to small farming communities with minimal safety testing. When problems arise, affected farmers are pressured to accept settlement agreements that prevent public discussion of safety concerns. The corporate representatives exchanged glances, and one began packing his briefcase. Sarah Mitchell stood abruptly. I think we've heard enough speculation for one evening. Dr. Walsh will continue providing proper medical care for these animals, and Agritech remains committed to supporting the farming families who've chosen to partner with us. As the meeting broke up, farmers clustered in small groups, their conversations intense and worried. The community was clearly divided, those willing to trust corporate assurances against those whose instincts warned of deeper problems. Martha Hoffman approached Mabel as they prepared to leave. "What do we do now?" Mabel looked around the room at faces she'd known for decades, farmers who'd trusted her judgment through countless animal health crises. "We document everything. We stick together. And we don't let them silence us with legal threats or financial incentives." The battle lines were drawn. The leaked document arrived through Eleanor's network 3 days after the contentious community meeting. A former Agritech employee, now working with environmental advocacy groups, had provided internal company memos dating back 18 months. The key document was stamped "Internal Use Only" and bore the heading "Nutrimax Beta Testing, Risk Assessment and Mitigation Strategies." Elena spread the printed pages across Mabel's kitchen table, her expression grim. "Mom, they knew. They absolutely knew this could happen." The memo detailed preliminary testing that had shown minor dermal irregularities in 12% of test animals. More damaging was the company's response. Rather than conduct additional safety studies, they had reclassified the symptoms as acceptable cosmetic variations and proceeded with limited field trials. But the most disturbing section outlined Agritech's strategy for handling problems that might arise during field testing. The company had budgeted for legal fees, settlement payments, and what they euphemistically called community relations management, a plan for controlling information and discrediting critics. "Look at this section." Elena pointed to a paragraph, highlighted in yellow. They specifically identify older veterinarians and environmental activists as potential sources of opposition. They have prepared responses for both groups. Mabel read the relevant passage with growing anger. Retired veterinarians may resist new methodologies due to outdated training and resistance to change. Recommended response: emphasize their lack of current certification and position younger. Licensed professionals as more credible sources of medical opinion. The strategy had worked perfectly against her. Dr. Walsh's dismissal of her concerns and Sarah Mitchell's questions about her credentials weren't spontaneous reactions. They were following a corporate playbook designed to marginalize opposition. "They're treating this entire community like a laboratory," Mabel said. Elena nodded. "And they're prepared to sacrifice animal welfare for data collection. This memo makes it clear they view the symptoms as acceptable losses in exchange for production increases." The afternoon brought a call from Tom Brennan that confirmed their worst fears. "Dr. Kemp, I've got 23 cows affected now, and the holes in the first ones are getting bigger. But that's not the worst part." "What's happened?" "Agritech sent 2 men in suits to my farm this morning. They offered to buy my entire herd at above market price, plus compensation for any inconvenience I've experienced. All I have to do is sign an agreement saying the animals were healthy when they purchased them." The buyout strategy was exactly what Elena's research had predicted: eliminate evidence by purchasing affected animals and removing them from public view. If Tom accepted the offer, Agritech would gain control of the physical proof of their product's harmful effects. "What did you tell them?" "That I needed to think about it. But Mabel, the money they're offering would solve all my financial problems. I could pay off the farm mortgage and have enough left over to start fresh somewhere else." The temptation was understandable. Tom's family had been struggling financially for years, and the mysterious cattle condition had made their situation desperate. The buyout offered escape from immediate problems, even if it meant abandoning 4 generations of family farming. But it also meant allowing Agritech to cover up evidence of their product's dangers, potentially condemning other farming communities. To similar experiences. That evening, Mabel and Elena visited Martha Hoffman, hoping the ranch matriarch's influence might help organize community resistance to Agritech's divide and conquer strategy. They found Martha in her kitchen, smoking a cigarette and staring at documents spread across the table. "They came to me too," Martha said without preamble. "Same offer, buy the herd, pay me compensation, make the whole problem disappear. Except they sweetened the deal with an additional payment they called a consulting fee for keeping quiet. About our experience. Are you considering it?" Martha's laugh was bitter. "At my age, what do I need with more money?" But they made it clear that refusing their offer might lead to complications, legal challenges to my operations, regulatory inspections, difficulties renewing permits, the kind of problems that can destroy a farm, even if you eventually win. The threat was subtle but effective. Small family farms operated on narrow margins and couldn't afford prolonged legal battles or regulatory disputes. Even frivolous challenges could force them out of business through legal fees and operational disruptions. Elena leaned forward. "Martha, we have evidence that Agritech has used these same tactics in other communities. They're counting on farmers being too isolated and financially vulnerable to resist." "What kind of evidence?" Elena shared the leaked memo, watching Martha's expression harden as she read about Agritech's calculated strategy for managing community relations. The older woman's anger was particularly focused on the company's dismissive attitude toward both the animals and the farmers who cared for them. "They think we're stupid," Martha said finally. "Country people too ignorant to understand their sophisticated business practices." "They're wrong about that," Mabel replied, "but they're counting on us staying divided and afraid." Martha stubbed out her cigarette with more force than necessary. "Then maybe it's time to remind them who they're dealing with." Over the next 2 hours, they developed a strategy that drew on Martha's deep connections within the farming community and Elena's experience with environmental organizing. Rather than fighting Agritech's buyout offers individually, they would coordinate a collective response that demonstrated community solidarity. The plan required convincing affected farmers to reject individual settlements in favor of a unified approach that would force public accountability. It was a risky strategy that asked people to sacrifice immediate financial relief for uncertain long-term benefits. But it was also the only approach that might prevent Agritech from successfully covering up the dangers of their product. Martha picked up her phone and began dialing. Bill Clearwater first. He's got military training, understands the value of coordinated action. Then the Johnson family and the Kowalskis up north. As Martha worked through her contact list, Mabel found herself thinking about Harold and the choices they'd made throughout their careers. They'd always tried to balance individual animal welfare with broader community interests, but they'd never faced a situation where corporate power was systematically deployed to silence legitimate concerns. Harold, quote, "S memory provided strength rather than painful nostalgia now." His commitment to patient advocacy and scientific integrity offered a moral foundation for challenging forces much larger than individual veterinary cases. Eleanor, quote, "S phone buzzed with a message from her environmental network. Mum, we might have more help than we thought. Word about Agritech's activities is spreading through advocacy groups across the Midwest. If we can document what's happening here, it could be part of a much larger challenge to unregulated feed additives." The stakes were growing beyond Millbrook County. Their local struggle was becoming part of a national conversation about corporate agriculture's impact on animal welfare and farming communities. But first, they had to convince their neighbors to risk their immediate economic security for principles that might not protect them from financial ruin. The locked filing cabinet in Dr. Walsh's office had been bothering Elena since their first conversation about professional credentials and current licensing. Something about his defensive posture and quick dismissal of her mother's concerns felt too calculated, too prepared. When Martha mentioned seeing Walsh's truck at Agritech's regional office the previous week, Elena's suspicions crystallized into determination. "Mom, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Has Dr. Walsh always been this dismissive of traditional veterinary approaches?" Mabel paused in her examination of tissue samples. "Actually, no. When he first started practicing here, he was eager to learn from experienced veterinarians. He even asked Harold and me for advice on several cases. When did that change? About 6 months ago. He suddenly became much more confident, started questioning established methods, bought expensive new equipment. I assumed it was natural professional development." Elena's laptop screen showed Dr. Walsh's veterinary practice website, which had been significantly updated in recent months. The new content emphasized cutting-edge agricultural science and partnership with leading industry innovators. Most telling was a testimonial page featuring quotes from corporate representatives praising Walsh's forward-thinking approach to modern farming challenges. "Mom, I think Dr. Walsh isn't just dismissing your concerns. I think he's actively working with Agritech to suppress them." The accusation hung in the air like an unthinkable betrayal. Professional disagreements were one thing, but deliberate deception violated every principle of veterinary ethics that had guided Mabel's career. "That's a serious charge, Elena. We can't make accusations like that without proof." Elena's phone buzzed with a message from her environmental network. The sender was identified only as Rural Vet Truth, but the content made her heart race. "Dr. Walsh, receiving payments from Agritech, can provide documentation if interested in protecting animal welfare." The anonymous contact agreed to meet at a coffee shop in the next county, away from Millbrook's small-town visibility. Elena drove alone, not wanting to expose her mother to potential legal complications. If the meeting went wrong, the contact turned out to be Dr. Rebecca Santos, a veterinarian from a neighboring county who'd encountered similar situations with Agritech. She was younger than Mabel, but older than Walsh, with the tired expression of someone who'd seen too much moral compromise in her profession. "Dr. Walsh approached me 6 months ago," Rebecca explained, sliding a manila folder across the table. "Asked if I'd be interested in consulting work with Agritech Solutions. Good money, flexible schedule, opportunity to influence agricultural innovation." Elena opened the folder to find copies of contracts, payment records, and correspondence between Walsh and Agritech representatives. The documentation painted a clear picture of financial incentives designed to secure Walsh's cooperation in managing community concerns about their products. What kind of consulting work? Initially, just reviewing their research data and providing professional opinions on product safety. But it quickly became clear they weren't interested in objective analysis. They wanted a licensed veterinarian willing to dismiss problems and reassure farmers that everything was fine. The contract terms were explicit. Walsh received monthly payments for professional consultation services, with bonus payments tied to successful community relations outcomes. The language was carefully crafted to avoid obvious corruption charges, but the intent was unmistakable. When I refused to continue, they told me other veterinarians were happy to work with them. They specifically mentioned Dr. Walsh as someone who understood the importance of supporting agricultural innovation. Elena studied the payment records. Walsh had received substantial sums over the past 6 months, enough to explain his expensive new equipment and updated facilities. The timing coincided perfectly with his changed attitude toward traditional veterinary approaches and his aggressive dismissal of concerns about Nutrimax. "Why are you sharing this with me?" Rebecca's expression hardened. "Because I've been tracking Agritech's activities across multiple counties. They're systematically corrupting veterinary professionals to provide cover for dangerous products. Someone needs to stop them before more animals are harmed." Driving back to Millbrook County, Elena struggled with the implications of what she'd learned. Dr. Walsh wasn't just professionally disagreeing with her mother's assessment. He was being paid to suppress evidence of Agritech's product causing harm. The betrayal went beyond personal conflict to systematic corruption of the professional standards that protected animal welfare. She found Mabel in Harold's study, surrounded by veterinary journals and medical texts, still searching for alternative explanations for the cattle symptoms. "Mum, we need to talk, and you're going to want to sit down." Eleanor shared Rebecca's documentation methodically, watching her mother's expression shift from skepticism to shock to anger. The evidence was comprehensive and damning. Walsh had essentially been bought by Agritech to provide professional cover for their experimental product. "This explains everything," Mabel said finally. "His resistance to investigating the connection between Nutrimax and the symptoms, his emphasis on my lack of current licensing, his dismissive attitude toward traditional diagnostic approaches. It's worse than that. Look at this correspondence." Elena pointed to emails showing Walsh providing Agritech with information about community discussions, farmer concerns, and even details about Mabel's independent investigation. He had been functioning as an intelligence asset, reporting on potential opposition to the company's interests. He's been telling them everything. Which farmers are most concerned, who might be willing to speak out, how to respond to specific criticisms. The betrayal was particularly painful because Walsh had been Harold's potential successor in serving the community. They had trusted him with relationships built over decades, believing that professional ethics would guide his decisions even when they disagreed about methods. But the documentation revealed something more disturbing than individual corruption. Agritech had developed a systematic approach to compromising veterinary oversight in rural communities. They identified young professionals facing financial pressures, offered lucrative consulting contracts, and gradually drew them into roles that prioritized corporate interests over animal welfare. How many other veterinarians are on their payroll? Mabel wondered aloud. Elena had been thinking the same thing. Rebecca mentioned that Walsh isn't the only one. Agritech is building a network of compromised professionals across multiple states. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Agritech wasn't just introducing dangerous products, they were systematically undermining the professional oversight designed to protect animals and farmers from corporate negligence. That evening, they called Martha Hoffman and Tom Brennan to share the revelations about Walsh's financial relationship with Agritech. The responses were swift and angry. "That son of a bitch," Martha said. "I trusted him with my animals because I thought he had their best interests at heart." Tom's reaction was more complex. "This changes everything, doesn't it? If our own veterinarian is working for the company that's poisoning our cattle, who can we trust?" The question highlighted the broader implications of Walsh's betrayal. Rural communities depended on professional relationships built over years of shared experience and mutual trust. When that trust was compromised by corporate influence, it threatened the entire social fabric that held farming communities together. But the revelation also provided new opportunities. Walsh's corruption could be documented and exposed, potentially forcing Agritech to defend their practices in public rather than operating through back-channel influence. "We need to decide how to use this information," Elena said. "Do we confront Walsh directly, or do we use it to build a broader case against Agritech?" Mabel considered the options carefully. Direct confrontation might force Walsh to destroy evidence or flee. But building a comprehensive case would take time they might not have, especially with more farmers facing pressure to accept buyout offers. "Both," she decided finally. "We use this documentation to expose the systematic corruption, but we also force Walsh to choose between his financial arrangements and his professional obligations." The battle was no longer just about animal welfare or even corporate accountability. It had become a fight for the integrity of the professional relationships that made rural communities function. Harold's press interview from 1994 had been tucked away in a folder marked Professional Recognition, a collection of newspaper clippings and certificates that Mabel had rarely looked at since his death. But Eleanor found it while organizing evidence for their upcoming confrontation with Agritech, and the faded newspaper article seemed to speak directly to their current situation. Ethical veterinary practice requires putting animal welfare above all other considerations, Harold had told the reporter. When commercial interests conflict with professional obligations, the choice should always be clear. Our first duty is to the animals who cannot speak for themselves. The interview had been prompted by a controversy over growth hormones in dairy cattle, and Harold's willingness to publicly challenge industry practices had made him temporarily unpopular with some corporate representatives. But his stance had ultimately been vindicated when federal regulators imposed restrictions on the hormones he'd criticized. He faced the same pressures we're facing now, Mabel realized, reading the article over Elena's shoulder. Corporate interests trying to silence veterinary concerns about product safety. Elena highlighted a particularly relevant quote. The moment we allow commercial considerations to override professional judgment, we betray not just the animals in our care, but the farming families who trust us to protect their livelihoods. The words provided both inspiration and a roadmap for what needed to happen next. Harold had demonstrated that individual veterinarians could challenge corporate power when they had community support and documented evidence of harm. Over the next 3 days, Mabel and Elena worked with Martha Hoffman to organize what they called a community documentation project. Rather than relying on individual testimony, they would create a comprehensive record of the cattle crisis that could withstand corporate attempts at dismissal or legal challenge. Martha's ranch became the unofficial headquarters for the effort. Her kitchen table, scarred by decades of family meals and farm business discussions, now served as a command center, where affected farmers brought photographs, medical records, and detailed timelines of their animals' symptoms. Bill Clearwater's military precision proved invaluable in organizing the evidence. He created detailed charts showing the progression of symptoms, correlation with Nutrimax introduction, and the absence of any other common factors among the affected farms. His documentation was thorough enough to satisfy scientific peer review and legal scrutiny. We're not just collecting stories, Bill explained to each farmer who contributed to the project. We're building a case that can stand up to the best lawyers Agritech can hire. Tom Brennan brought more than documentation. He brought moral authority as a fourth-generation farmer whose family's reputation was built on careful stewardship of their land and animals. His willingness to reject Agritech's buyout offer despite his financial struggles demonstrated the kind of principled commitment that could inspire others to similar courage. My grandfather used to say that a man's word was only as good as his willingness to stand behind it when doing so cost him something, Tom told the group gathered in Martha's kitchen. Well, this is costing all of us something. But our word to these animals and to each other is worth more than Agritech's money. The community response surprised even Elena, whose experience with environmental organizing had taught her to expect resistance from rural populations. But the systematic nature of Agritech's deception, particularly Dr. Walsh's betrayal of professional trust, had galvanized farmers who might otherwise have been skeptical of outside intervention. Dr. Rebecca Santos arrived from the neighboring county, bringing documentation of similar cases that Agritech had successfully covered up through settlement agreements and non-disclosure clauses. Her evidence showed that the Millbrook County situation was part of a multi-state pattern of experimental product testing disguised as normal agricultural commerce. They're using rural communities as laboratories, Rebecca explained to the assembled farmers. Small towns with limited regulatory oversight, populations that trust professional authorities, and economic pressures that make resistance difficult. Elena used her environmental network connections to coordinate with investigative journalists and regulatory advocates in other states. What had started as a local animal welfare crisis was becoming part of a national conversation about corporate agriculture's impact on farming communities. But the most crucial element of their preparation involved confronting Dr. Walsh directly. The evidence of his financial relationship with Agritech was damning, but they needed to give him an opportunity to choose professional integrity over corporate loyalty. Mabel called Walsh's office and requested a meeting to discuss the ongoing cattle crisis. His receptionist, clearly uncomfortable with the request, eventually agreed to a brief appointment that afternoon. Walsh, S veterinary clinic reflected the upgrades his Agritech consulting fees had funded. New diagnostic equipment, recently renovated, examination rooms, and a professional appearance that projected success and competence. But Mabel noticed that the walls, once decorated with photographs of local farmers and their animals, now featured certificates from corporate agricultural organizations and awards from industry groups. Dr. Kemp, I appreciate you coming in, but I'm not sure what we have to discuss. My position on the current situation is well documented. Eleanor spread Dr. Rebecca Santos's documentation across Walsh's desk. Contracts, payment records, and correspondence that detailed his financial relationship with Agritech. Walsh's professional composure faltered as he recognized the implications of what they'd uncovered. "Where did you get these?" "Does it matter?" Mabel asked. "The question is whether you're willing to put your professional obligations above your consulting income." Walsh's response revealed the moral complexity of his situation. The Agritech consulting fees had allowed him to expand his practice, invest in better equipment, and provide higher quality care for the animals he treated. The financial relationship hadn't started as corruption. It had begun as a legitimate opportunity to influence agricultural innovation while improving his professional capabilities. "I genuinely believed I was helping to develop safer, more effective products," Walsh said. "The consulting work was supposed to be about improving animal welfare through scientific advancement. When did that change?" "Gradually. They wanted me to downplay concerns about side effects, emphasize economic benefits over health considerations, and provide professional cover for products that hadn't completed proper safety testing." Elena leaned forward. "And you went along with it because the money was too good to refuse." Walsh's silence was answer enough. The corruption had been subtle, incremental, and financially seductive. Each compromise had seemed minor individually, but collectively they had transformed him from an advocate for animal welfare into a corporate asset. "You still have a choice," Mabel said. "You can continue protecting Agritech's interests, or you can fulfill your professional obligations to these animals and their owners. If I break the consulting agreement, they'll sue me for breach of contract and disclosure of proprietary information. I could lose my practice, my license, everything I've worked for. And if you don't, you'll lose something more important, your professional integrity and the trust of the community you're supposed to serve." The meeting ended without Walsh making a commitment, but Mabel could see the internal struggle in his expression. The easy money and corporate approval had come at a cost. He was only beginning to recognize. That evening, Martha's Kitchen hosted the final planning session for their public confrontation with Agritech. The county health department had agreed to hold a public hearing on the cattle crisis, providing an official forum where their documentation could be presented and challenged. "They'll bring lawyers, corporate scientists, and probably try to discredit all of us," Elena warned. "We need to be prepared for personal attacks, legal threats, and attempts to divide the community." But the farmers who had committed to the effort showed remarkable unity and determination. 4 generations of agricultural experience had taught them to recognize threats to their way of life, and Agritech's systematic deception represented exactly the kind of corporate overreach they'd spent lifetimes resisting. Tom Brennan spoke for the group. "We've got the truth, we've got each other, and we've got nothing left to lose. That's more than enough to take on any corporation." As the meeting broke up, Mabel found herself standing in Martha's yard, looking across the moonlit pastures where affected cattle grazed peacefully, unaware of the battle being fought on their behalf. Harold's words from the old newspaper interview echoed in her mind. "Our first duty is to the animals who cannot speak for themselves." Tomorrow, she would have the chance to honor that duty in the most public and consequential way of her career. The microphone at the county health department podium had amplified voices in this room for over 50 years. Farmers reporting disease outbreaks, officials announcing policy changes, and occasionally citizens challenging decisions that affected their livelihoods. Today, it would carry Mabel's words into a confrontation that could determine the future of agricultural oversight in rural Wisconsin. Agritech had arrived in force. Sarah Mitchell sat at the front table, flanked by 3 attorneys in expensive suits, a corporate scientist with an impressive resume displayed on poster boards, and a public relations specialist who took notes on every speaker. Their presentation materials filled one side of the room, glossy charts showing increased milk production, statistical analyses of economic benefits, and testimonials from satisfied customers in other states. Dr. Walsh sat separately, his expression carefully neutral but his body language revealing internal conflict. The documentation of his financial relationship with Agritech had been provided to the health department officials that morning, but he hadn't yet been publicly confronted with his divided loyalties. County Health Director Margaret Chen called the hearing to order, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to mediating disputes between competing interests. "We're here to examine concerns about livestock health in relation to feed supplement usage. This is a fact-finding session, not a legal proceeding, but all testimony will be recorded and may be used in future regulatory decisions." Sarah Mitchell spoke first, her presentation polished and confident. Agritech Solutions is committed to advancing agricultural science through innovative nutrition products. Nutrimax represents years of research and development, extensive testing, and proven results in increasing dairy productivity. She clicked through slides showing impressive statistics. Milk production increases, improved feed efficiency, and economic benefits for farming operations. The data was legitimate and compelling, painting a picture of scientific progress that benefited both farmers and consumers. The minor cosmetic variations some farmers have observed are temporary side effects that resolve naturally as animals adjust to optimize nutrition. These symptoms pose no threat to animal welfare or food safety, and any economic losses are far outweighed by production gains. The corporate scientist, Dr. Marcus Webb, reinforced Sarah's message with technical language designed to overwhelm lay audiences. His presentation emphasized laboratory testing, peer review processes, and regulatory compliance, all delivered with the authority of advanced degrees and corporate backing. Dermal manifestations consistent with metabolic adjustment are well documented. Responses to enhanced nutritional protocols, Dr. Webb explained, using medical terminology that made the holes in cattle hide sound routine and benign. Our comprehensive analysis indicates no causal relationship between Nutrimax and any pathological conditions. When Martha Hoffman was called to testify, her plain-spoken response cut through the corporate jargon like a knife through butter. "I've been raising cattle for 47 years, and I've never seen anything like what's happening to my animals. You can call it dermal manifestations or metabolic adjustment. But what I see are holes in my cows that weren't there before I started using your product." Tom Brennan followed with emotional testimony about his family's four-generation commitment to animal welfare and responsible farming. "My great-grandfather would be ashamed to see what's happening to animals under my care. These aren't minor cosmetic issues, they're symptoms of something seriously wrong." Bill Clearwater's military precision was evident in his methodical presentation of documentation correlating Nutramax introduction with symptom development across multiple farms. His charts and timelines provided visual evidence that even corporate lawyers couldn't dismiss. But the most powerful testimony came from Dr. Rebecca Santos, who had driven from the neighboring county to share her experience with agritech's tactics in other rural communities. "This pattern is being repeated across multiple states," she explained, presenting evidence of similar livestock problems linked to agritech products. The company introduces experimental additives to small farming communities, then uses financial pressure and professional manipulation to silence concerns when problems arise. Sarah Mitchell objected strenuously to Rebecca's testimony. "These unsubstantiated allegations from outside parties have no relevance to the specific situation we're discussing here." But Health Director Chen allowed the testimony to continue, recognizing that broader patterns were relevant to evaluating local concerns. Elena took the podium with documentation of agritech's systematic approach to managing community opposition. Her presentation revealed the company's internal strategy for identifying and neutralizing potential critics, including specific plans for dealing with older veterinarians and environmental activists. "This isn't a disagreement about agricultural science," Elena explained. "This is a case study in corporate manipulation of rural communities for experimental purposes." The health department officials, who had expected a routine discussion of livestock health concerns, found themselves confronting evidence of systematic corporate deception that extended far beyond feed supplement safety. When Mabel was finally called to testify, the room fell silent. Her reputation in the community carried weight that corporate presentations couldn't match, and everyone present understood that her words would carry special significance. She approached the microphone slowly, carrying the tissue samples and documentation that had started her investigation weeks earlier. Harold's memory seemed to guide her as she began to speak. The tissue samples Mabel placed on the hearing room table represented 43 years of veterinary experience, distilled into physical evidence that no corporate lawyer could dismiss. Under Harold's old microscope, these samples had revealed cellular destruction unlike anything she'd encountered in 4 decades of practice, and now they would serve as the foundation for challenging agritech's carefully constructed narrative. "I've examined livestock for most of my adult life," Mabel began, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "I've seen bacterial infections, viral diseases, parasitic infestations, and environmental toxins. What I see in these tissue samples doesn't match any of those familiar patterns." She gestured to the microscopic photographs Eleanor had helped her prepare, images that showed the precise cellular breakdown occurring at the edges of the mysterious holes. "These animals aren't experiencing metabolic adjustment or minor cosmetic variations. Their immune systems are being suppressed to the point where they can't recognize tissue destruction as injury. That's why they show no pain response. Their bodies can't mount a normal inflammatory response." Sarah Mitchell shifted uncomfortably as Mabel continued. "This isn't speculation. It's documented medical observation based on systematic examination of affected animals across multiple farms." Dr. Webb attempted to interrupt with technical objections about proper laboratory procedures and chain of custody for samples, but Health Director Chen gestured for Mabel to continue. "The timing correlation is impossible to ignore. Nutramax was introduced to all 3 farms within a 2-week period in March. Symptoms appeared in every case between 14 and 21 days later. No other common factors exist among these. Operations. Martha Hoffman stood from her seat in the audience, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had outlasted multiple attempts to silence rural voices. Dr. Kemp isn't just presenting medical opinion, she's telling us what our own eyes have been seeing for weeks. These corporate representatives can use all the fancy language they want, but they can't change what's happening to our animals. The Seaway room erupted as other farmers voiced their support. Tom Brennan stood to address the health department officials directly. We trusted Dr. Walsh because we thought he had our animals' best interests at heart. Now we find out he's been taking money from the same company that's causing these problems. All eyes turned to Dr. Walsh, whose internal struggle had been evident throughout the hearing. Sarah Mitchell's expression showed alarm as she realized that Walsh's credibility, essential to their defense strategy, was about to be challenged publicly. Dr. Walsh, Health Director Chen said, "Would you like to respond to these allegations?" The moment stretched into uncomfortable silence as Walsh wrestled with a decision that would define the rest of his career. The consulting payments from Agritech had provided financial security and professional recognition, but they had come at the cost of his integrity and the trust of the community he served. Finally, he stood and walked to the microphone, his face pale but his voice clear. "I need to make a confession that should have come weeks ago." Sarah Mitchell rose from her chair. "Dr. Walsh, I must advise you that your consulting agreement includes confidentiality clauses The confidentiality clauses don't apply when animal welfare is at stake," Walsh interrupted. "And that's exactly what we're dealing with here." He turned to face the room full of farmers he had served and increasingly betrayed. "I've been receiving consulting payments from Agritech Solutions for the past 6 months. Those payments influence my professional judgment about Nutrimax and the symptoms your animals have been experiencing." The admission sent shockwaves through the room. Even those who had suspected Walsh's compromise were stunned by his public acknowledgement of the conflict. "The tissue damage Dr. Kemp has documented is real and significant," Walsh continued. "I dismissed her concerns, not because they were scientifically invalid, but because acknowledging them would have jeopardized my financial arrangement with Agritech." Sarah Mitchell and her legal team exchanged urgent whispers, their carefully planned defense strategy collapsing as their key professional witness repudiated his own testimony. Walsh pulled a folder from his briefcase. "I have documentation showing that Agritech was aware of potential side effects before introducing Nutrimax to local farms. They viewed this community as a testing ground for experimental additives with known risks." Elena stood to accept the key documents Walsh offered, her expression mixing vindication with sadness for the professional destruction he was bringing upon himself. These internal communications show that Agritech budgeted for livestock losses and farmer settlements as acceptable. "Costs of product development," Walsh explained to the stunned health department officials. "They never intended to protect animal welfare. They intended to manage the consequences of compromising it." The corporate representatives packed their materials hastily as Walsh's testimony demolished their position beyond repair. Sarah Mitchell made a final attempt to control the narrative. "These allegations will be thoroughly investigated by our legal team. Agritech stands behind its products and its commitment to agricultural innovation." But her words carried no weight against the combination of scientific evidence, community testimony, and professional confession that had been presented. The hearing room buzzed with conversations as farmers processed the full scope of the deception they had encountered. Health Director Chen called for order. "This hearing is concluded pending further investigation by appropriate regulatory authorities. All testimony will be forwarded to state agricultural officials for review." The battle was won, but the war for agricultural accountability was just beginning. 6 months after the county health department hearing, Mabel stood in Martha Hoffman's kitchen, watching the older woman sign the charter document that would establish the Millbrook County Independent Feed Cooperative. The paper represented something Harold would have been proud of: farmers taking control of their own destiny rather than relying on corporate promises that put profit ahead of animal welfare. The recovered tissue samples that had served as evidence in the hearing now resided in a state laboratory where researchers were using them to develop better testing protocols for feed additives. What had started as mysterious holes in cattle hides had become the foundation for improved regulatory oversight that would protect farming communities across multiple states. Never thought I'd live to see the day when farmers had to band together to protect themselves from their own veterinarians and feed companies, Martha said, her voice carrying satisfaction mixed with lingering anger about the deception they'd uncovered. The cooperative represented more than just an alternative source for animal feed. It embodied the community values that had sustained rural life for generations. Member farmers would share costs, pool their purchasing power, and maintain collective oversight of everything their animals consumed. Tom Brennan's cattle had been among the first to recover once Nutrimax was removed from their diet. The mysterious holes had gradually closed, leaving only faint scars as reminders of their ordeal. More importantly, the animals' natural immune responses had returned to normal, allowing them to react appropriately to injuries and infections. The production numbers aren't quite as high as they were with Nutrimax, Tom admitted, but I sleep better knowing my animals are healthy rather than drugged into compliance. Agritech Solutions faced a cascade of legal and regulatory consequences that had effectively ended their experimental feed additive program. Class action lawsuits from affected farmers in 7 states had forced the company into bankruptcy, while federal investigators had launched a comprehensive review of agricultural product testing requirements. Dr. Walsh's professional situation remained complicated. His veterinary license had been suspended pending investigation by the state board, and his consulting relationship with Agritech had been terminated immediately after his public confession. But his willingness to provide evidence against the company had earned him some measure of community forgiveness, and several farmers had indicated they might work with him again once he completed professional rehabilitation requirements. He made a mistake, Bill Clearwater had said, but at least he had the courage to admit it when it mattered most. Sarah Mitchell and her corporate colleagues had disappeared from the area as quickly as they'd arrived, reassigned to other markets, where Agritech's reputation hadn't yet been destroyed, but their tactics had been documented and shared through agricultural networks, making it harder for similar deception to succeed elsewhere. Elena had decided to move back to Wisconsin permanently, combining her environmental advocacy work with support for sustainable farming practices. Her relationship with her mother had been transformed by their shared battle against corporate deception, replacing years of tension with mutual respect and common purpose. I never understood how hard it was to maintain integrity in a system designed to reward compromise, Elena told Mabel as they walked through Harold's garden, now thriving under their joint care. What you and Dad did for 40 years, putting animal welfare above everything else, that took more courage than I realized. The garden had become a symbol of their renewed relationship and their shared commitment to patient cultivation of what mattered most. Harold's roses bloomed more abundantly than they had since his death, as if responding to the attention and care that came from working together rather than alone. Mabel had found new purpose in consulting with farming communities, facing similar challenges from corporate agriculture. Her experience with Agritech had made her a sought-after expert on identifying and resisting deceptive marketing practices. More importantly, it had connected her with a network of veterinarians committed to maintaining professional integrity. Despite financial pressures, Harold always said that retirement should be about doing what matters most without worrying about what it pays, Mabel reflected, watching Elena deadhead roses with the same careful attention Harold had always shown. I think he would have approved of how this all turned out, The new feed cooperative charter that Martha had signed represented the document's official name, but farmers had taken to calling it simply the Independence Papers, a declaration that they would no longer allow corporate interests to make decisions about animal welfare on their behalf. The cooperative's first major purchase had been a mobile testing laboratory that would allow member farms to analyze feed samples before introducing new products to their animals. It was a practical investment that would prevent future deceptions like the Nutrimax scandal. But the cooperative's deeper significance lay in its restoration of community self-reliance. Farmers who had been isolated by corporate marketing strategies were now connected through shared ownership and mutual accountability. They made decisions collectively, shared risks equitably, and maintained the kind of neighborly support that had sustained rural communities for generations. As autumn settled over Millbrook County, Mabel often found herself sitting in Harold's chair, reading veterinary journals and staying current with developments in agricultural science. But now Elena would join her in the evenings, bringing her own expertise in environmental science and regulatory policy. "We make a good team," Elena said one evening as they reviewed legislation that would strengthen oversight of feed additives. "Maybe we should consider making this partnership official." The suggestion of joining their professional efforts had emerged naturally from their successful collaboration against agritech. Elena's network of environmental advocates complemented Mabel's agricultural expertise, creating opportunities to protect farming communities while promoting sustainable practices. Looking back on the crisis that had brought them together, Mabel realized that Harold's memory had been honored in ways she couldn't have anticipated. His commitment to animal welfare had inspired their resistance to corporate deception. His belief in community solidarity had guided their organizing efforts, and his conviction that professional integrity mattered more than financial success had ultimately prevailed against powerful opposition. The cattle in Martha Hoffman's pastures grazed peacefully under the October sun, their hides unmarred by mysterious holes, their natural responses restored to healthy function. They were, once again, animals rather than production units, protected by farmers who remembered that stewardship meant more than maximizing profit. In Harold's garden, the last roses of the season bloomed with quiet beauty, tended by hands that had learned to work together rather than apart.